What's up, GamerGate? So, now that the election is over with, the media is back to peddling the fiction that video games are causing violence. And here is the originator of that hypothesis, Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman on Fox News, explaining the evidence behind it. Take a listen.
What's the evidence between video games and violence?
In a 60-minute Vanity Fair poll, 84% of the population believes that this is having an impact.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, that's probably because 84% of the population is fucking stupid. No, actually, I take that back. I promised myself I'd never Jon Stewart anybody, so I will flesh out Dave Grossman's argument, give it its full due, then explain to you, scientifically, why he is mistaken. In order to fully understand Colonel Grossman's hypothesis, you need to become familiar with two different methods of controlling human behavior. The first is called classical conditioning. You might remember from psychology class about how Ivan Pavlov was able to use this method to make dogs salivate whenever they hear a bell ring. This method requires a potent biological stimulus, such as food, in order to produce a reflexive behavior, such as drooling. So it's all in the reflexes. That's what this method of conditioning does. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, uses rewards and punishment in order to influence a person's behavior. So, for example, a child would put his or her toys away in order to get a dessert. Do you understand the difference? It's about reflexes, so like, reflexes, right? Versus behavior. I'm going to put my toys away because I want a dessert. So it's two different parts of the brain here that we're dealing with. Operant conditioning happens right here in the frontal lobe, where it gives you the ability to control your impulses in order to have a future reward or avoid a future punishment, while classical conditioning is right here in the spine, this animalistic part of your brain. So when fight or flight happens, when you're terrified and you just start moving automatically, that's this part right here. And this can be conditioned to make soldiers kill. During basic training, soldiers are classically conditioned to shoot the enemy through range training and operantly conditioned to want to kill the enemy through cadences. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a cadence is, it's when you see those big badass drill sergeants marching their troops and they're singing something that goes something like, a murder, murder, a kill, kill, 'cause shit gets real on the battlefield. You know, it's this violent imagery, this violent sayings repeated over and over again melodically until the soldier gets in his brain, yes, I actually want to kill somebody. It sort of hypnotizes them, gives them that killer instinct so that they can perform on the battlefield. And this brings me to Colonel Grossman's hypothesis. It was the central argument in his book on killing, is that video games are classically and operantly conditioning children to become killers.
And when I began to become aware of how we teach soldiers in Copsicle, how we have to condition them to be able to pull the trigger, to overcome the resistance, we realized that video games doing the same things to the kids.
But here's the problem, Colonel Grossman, is that in order for this conditioning to actually cause violence, there has to be a high level of verisimilitude. Okay, it has to be very similar to the conditions of combat in order for your reflexes to take place. And I think that Colonel Grossman is aware of this to a degree, but he does confuse classical conditioning with operant conditioning in this interview, at least.
But anybody who's been in the armed forces or law enforcement in the last 50 years, you don't shoot bullseye targets, you shoot a man-shaped silhouette, a photorealistic target. We go to the qualification range. We no longer shoot at bullseye targets. We shoot at pop-up targets. We hit the target drops. It's B.F. Skinner. It's straight up operant conditioning.
Let me give you an example. So you could say, oh, well, Call of Duty, that's very, very realistic, okay? But what happens with your nervous system, with your reflexes, if you're conditioned through Call of Duty, if you're in that situation in real life? What are your reflexes here? If you get in a fight or flight, This is your reflexes, okay? This is what happens. What doesn't happen after being conditioned by Call of Duty is this. It's a BB gun, but my point is this. The difference is in the action. So you are classically conditioned to manipulate a joystick versus loading a magazine, cocking it, and firing. Now, I will add a caveat here in that it's possible, especially with virtual reality technology, to make the simulation ultra realistic to where that conditioning could take place. However, there's no games on the market that are hyper realistic as these military simulations. There just isn't. There could be, but there isn't, and so it couldn't be the cause of violence. Okay, so video games aren't classically conditioning kids to be killers, but are video games operantly conditioning kids to be killers? So, for example, you see violence in video games and you say, yes, you know, this is good behavior, this is what I want to do, and you get more points for it and all of this kind of stuff. But ultra-violent video games like Mortal Kombat didn't really start showing up until around 1991, 1992, and as it turns out, that's when violent crime rate started to decline. Now, I don't mean to suggest that violent video games prevent violence either. I don't know. There is a correlation there, but correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation, as we all know. What Colonel Grossman does know, because I do remember reading this in On Killing, is that video games sort of would have the same kind of conditioning that violent movies or violent television also has. Just sort of this glorification of violence, wanting to get people to worship violence. However, Colonel Grossman doesn't go on television talking about this as much as video games. Why? And this is my own hypothesis. Because the video game industry is in direct competition with the television industry, with the movie industry. Because if you're playing video games, you're probably not watching Fox News or ABC or whatever. So the video game industry eats into their advertising dollars, and so they have these little segments where they try to scare parents into banning video games. It's nonsense. It's complete bunk. And that's all I got for today. Please spread this around, so let's finally kill this myth that video games cause violence once and for all. Thank you for watching.